Welcome to this week's episode of Insight. During this week's show, we're going to cover two topics. The first one is going to be some developments in the energy sector and what impact they could have on Armenia and the region. And the second one is going to be on the great uprising against the Erdogan regime in Turkey over the last few weeks. This week, in response to the massive tariffs that were announced by President Trump in the United States a few days ago, there has been a massive decline in energy prices, both oil and natural gas. It is because essentially the markets around the world believe that these tariffs are going to lead to a worldwide recession, and a worldwide recession, which is quite likely at this point, is going to lead to lower energy prices. There are obviously other reasons for a decline, and we're going to specifically talk about oil prices. One of it is that OPEC and OPEC Plus, which is actually a conglomeration of countries like Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, and Russia, cooperating with OPEC, have artificially kept production low to keep prices high, and that is being changed. They're essentially letting go and allowing far more production of oil to come into the market, along with the fact that we could have possibly actually hit peak oil, primarily driven by a slowdown in demand from China, which is actually making it a tremendous and quick move towards electric vehicles. All of this, by the way, is coming at a time where we're actually heading towards a gas glut, in which we're probably going to be dealing with lower natural gas prices in a long-term basis. If you look at the chart that we have, you will see this massive amount of natural gas that's coming online, and the chart is just from the United States, while at the same time, we know there's a lot of projects from Qatar and Australia and other places that are coming online. The Qatar one specifically is so massive, it's going to provide 40% of the natural gas that Germany needs. All of this was prompted by this great effort, mostly by the European countries, to break away from Russian dependency. And what happened between 22 and now is you had these massive shift in production increases all around the world that are starting to kick in. So we're heading into a situation in which you're going to have a long-term glut in the gas market. Now you might ask, what impact would this decline in oil prices or energy prices overall would have on Armenia? It will actually have a lot of impact, given the fact that we're a net energy importer. It's actually going to lower our trade deficit with other countries. A crash in oil prices is actually going to impact many of the markets that we export to, primarily Russia, but also some Middle Eastern countries, which actually will have less resources to buy our products. Interestingly enough, a crash in oil prices might actually end the war in Ukraine, because it's going to make it much harder for Mr. Putin to continue his war. So Donald Trump might actually end the war not by negotiations, but by destroying the Russian economy. One of the negative impacts of lower energy prices is it makes the move to renewables less likely, is because when energy prices are low, renewables are expensive next to it. So they become less economical at a time when we actually should be aggressively moving towards renewables for both economic and security reasons. But frankly, all of these impacts that I've outlined are secondary to security ones. And this actually relates to our neighboring country. The budgetary breakpoint for the regime in Baku, for them to actually fulfill their budget, depending on the year, is between $70 to $80 a barrel of oil. Any oil price lower than that would mean that they actually have to cut their budget or their expenditures, or actually dig into their national reserves, which overall are the equivalent of 2 or 3 years of their yearly spending, depending on whose numbers you believe. In a long-term basis, a lower energy price will almost certainly lead to the devaluation of the national currency, the manat. This is something actually was predicted by the most famous Azeri economist, Gubad Ibadoglu, who is actually sitting in jail in Baku, because in mono-exporting countries, your currency is actually matched in value to whatever your export commodity is that you make your money off of. Devaluation of any currency means lower living standards and usually a political crisis. What we have seen over the past decade is low oil prices have always meant aggression by the Azeri regime against Armenia and Armenians. We saw this in 2016. We saw this in 2020 after the COVID crisis with the crashed energy prices. Obviously, this is not the only thing that leads to aggression, but obviously it makes it more likely. This also means that the Azeri EU gas project, which was much lauded in 22, is probably dead because it's simply not economical, and they're expecting the EU to actually pay for these pipelines for gas that doesn't exist or is far too expensive to bring to market. And why is this relevant? Because at this point, with the European Union, the only card that the Azeris hold is actually their supposed energy potential that actually isn't there. And the faster that project blows up, the better. On a long-term basis, the reality is from this point to about 2030 to 2032 are the last oil years for Azerbaijan. So a consistent low oil price over the next few years, the last few years that matter in oil production in that country, is going to mean that they're going to have much more problems much more quickly, because we're actually dealing with two sets of 0 hours when it comes to our neighboring country. The first one is when they're out of oil, which is somewhere over the next 5 to 7 years. And the second one is when the regime will essentially come to an end, as every totalitarian regime eventually collapses. And these two dates and these 2 0 hours are actually very much married together. A consistent oil price now over the last of these years means that 0 hour is going to come to us faster than people expect. In short, what is good for us in the long term, as far as having a neighbor that is not economically viable, makes everything dangerous in the short term. Now we're going to move on to this great big uprising against Mr. Erdogan in Turkey. These are what we've witnessed over the last 3 or 4 weeks, are some of the largest demonstrations in that country since the famous Gezi Park protests, which happened in 2013. What triggered this was the arrest of the very popular mayor of Istanbul, Ekrem İmamoğlu, on essentially made-up charges. He is being charged in supposedly for cases of corruption, but in reality he's being charged because in polling he's actually more popular than Mr. Erdogan. And after I have witnessed the communication response and his political response to his arrest, it's very clear why Mr. Erdogan arrested him, because frankly he's very charismatic, he's a very operative politician. You know, he's got a photogenic wife and a properly pious-looking mother. So he's sort of a nightmare for Mr. Erdogan to eventually run against. This has led to massive demonstrations initially after the arrest around the country, mostly led by young people whose politics actually range from hard left to nationalist right. This is actually a genuine movement across the country. And given the repressive and violent nature of the state response, these people out there battling with the police on a nightly basis are actually quite brave, because they're not really operating in a democratic country. You know, in analyzing all of this, there's a lot of hand-wringing by what they call the white Turks, this sort of English-speaking Istanbul Turks, and their good friends, there's this whole cadre of pro-Turkish Westerners who always want us to believe that within every Turk there's a Swede waiting to, get out. They claim that this latest arrest of the mayor of Istanbul is the end of Turkish democracy. This reminds me of a famous back and forth with Mr. Gandhi when he was asked what he thought of Western civilization, and he thought it would be a good idea. The same can be said of Turkish democracy, which in real terms has never really existed. If you imagine democracy to be more than just voting, and democracy obviously is a lot more than that. It's about rule of law. It is about having a standard system, freedom of speech, and equal rights for all citizens, something that has never existed in the Turkish Republic. For the past 10 years, Mr. Erdogan has removed dozens of Kurdish mayors all over eastern Turkey, Western Armenia, put them in jail, and did the same with a lot of other progressive politicians in the country. And almost none of these people that are out demonstrating ever said a word about them. Having said that, it's very hard not to sympathize, especially with the young people out there fighting the regime in Ankara, because I think many of them actually want a normal democratic country. However, we need to be entirely realistic about this. The constituencies for a real democratic country in Turkey don't go beyond 15-20% of the population. And Mr. Erdogan is likely to win this fight and to destroy the last fig leaf of democracy in Turkey and turn it into the actual real Western Azerbaijan. We should note that historically all reform movements in Turkey, from the Young Turks to Mr. Erdogan, and people forget that Erdogan's first 10 years he was a reformer, have always ended in tears for a simple reason. Historically, and unfortunately, when most of the Turkish population has been given a choice between a normal democratic country with equal rights for all her citizens and a repressive country that is willing to oppress or murder the given outed hate group of the day or the minority of the day, most Turks have usually chosen the latter. What the white Turks and the Kemalists are finding out now is they're simply next on the list. As the French would say, c'est la vie, salope. Thank you for joining me in this week's episode of Insights.
أشرفي